My name is Peter Zellner, and along with David Bergman, who's here somewhere, we coordinate the SCIFI, which is the Future Initiatives program here at SCI-Arc. It's a program that is primarily aimed at dealing with urban scale issues and issues of policy. To my left is Sam Lubell, who's the editor of the Architects newspaper, and without Sam's initiative, we wouldn't have this presentation today. A new infrastructure, innovative transit solutions for Los Angeles. Let me begin just by thanking our jurors, some of whom are here, some of whom are not. The jury convened for this competition last Monday and included Tom Main, founder of Morphosis Architects and professor at UCLA, Pritzker Prize-winning architect. Aspet Davidian, here to my left, Director of Project Engineering Facilities, LA County Metropolitan Transportation Authority, Metro. Thank you for your support of this initiative. Without it, I think probably wouldn't have gotten the discussion started. To his right is Neil Denari, professor at UCLA and principal of Neil M. Denari Architects. Not here today, but I'd like to thank is Cecilia B. Estelano, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the CRA LA Community Redevelopment Agency of Los Angeles. Next to Neil is Roland Genik, urban planner and transit designer for the Expo line. And finally, we're very honored to have Gail Goldberg, Director of Planning in the City of Los Angeles, with us today on the jury, and will be making some opening comments for us. Let me also thank our sponsors, our corporate sponsors in particular, our patrons, AECOM and ARAP. Thank you for your support. Also, we have the support of Assessment Prasia Design. Our institutional partners included the AIA Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Forum for Architecture and Urban Design, the American Planning Association California Chapter Los Angeles, Metro, of course, our media partner, Paul Petrini, I don't know if you're here, thank you, Arconnect. And finally, this event would not have been possible without funding in part from a grant from the City of Los Angeles Department of Cultural Affairs. That's the DCA, thank you, in particular to Joe Smoke, and thank you to Sam Lubell from the Architects newspaper. So, Gail, if I may.
Thank you very much. Well, it is a pleasure to be here today as a follow-up to a long day of the jurors looking at all these wonderful entries. And I wanted to come here today. I actually have to leave shortly. I have another commitment that I have to be at, and I also thought that it would be more fun for me if all of the designers are on the hot seat when all of you start questioning their selections and defending your own selections. I can only tell you it was an interesting and an inspiring day for all of us to spend an entire day looking at both the student entries and the professional entries. I want to thank Peter and Sam, SCI-Arc, and the Architects newspaper for putting this together. It is, of course, wonderfully timely as we are facing the prospect over the next 30 years of using this half-cent sales tax that was approved under Measure R to really improve transit in our region, and we are very excited about that. We looked all day at many entries, and we were, I think, all reminded of the power of infrastructure. While often our infrastructure is designed to meet a current need, I think we all recognize that that infrastructure typically afterwards guides urban design decisions for the next 50 or 100 years. And so what we do today is very important, not only in meeting and taking care of some of the problems we have today, but also because it often sets an urban form for the future. And we understood how important that was. It was inspiring, I think, for all of us to see the entries from both the professionals and the students who seem to clearly understand sort of our future needs and design projects around meeting the needs of a 2030 or 2050 Los Angeles, and that was, I think, extremely exciting for all of us to see. We are, I like to remind people, the last great large American unfinished city. And so the decisions we are making about our city will ultimately decide who it is that we become and what this place is that we inhabit. And we are, I think, very excited about the inspiration provided by these entries. As we looked at the entries, there were a number of themes that sort of emerged. Many of the entries looked at urban design, at land use. Many of them integrated exciting new architecture, and almost all of them integrated to some degree or another new technology. Technology that will change, I think, all of our great American cities and world cities as we look to the future. So it was, for all of us, a very exciting day. And I want to congratulate all of the folks who entered this idea contest, if you will. It seems to me so Los Angeles. We are the creative capital of the world, and I love the idea that we are not only creative in our entertainment industry, but we can be very creative in terms of how we build this wonderful city that we live in. So I want to congratulate all of the entrants, both the student and the professional. It was extremely difficult, I think, for all of us to cull down and come up with winners, because the reality is that each of the entries in one way or another inspired us to think in a different way or to see a problem in a different way. And so I love the whole creative aspect of this, and I congratulate all of you and thank you all very much for your participation, not only in the contest, but in coming here today and joining with the judges to really have a dialogue about the future of this city and to really think about the ideas that were promoted in all of the proposals that we looked at. So thank you all very, very much. Thank you for including me. It was a challenge, I think, for Cecilia and I, who are probably the ones closest to implementation and practicality. And we were, of course, inspired by the designers in our midst who were wonderfully futuristic and had so many great ideas. So thank you all very much.
All right, well, I mean, you know, in a way, it's now almost a week since we, as a jury, had a look at the work, and hopefully the jury's had some time to absorb the entries. There were many, as Sam said, there were 76. There were a lot of ideas that came our way, and in fact, too many to premiate. But what I'd like to do is start this discussion by talking about the relationship between transit, urban design, city making, and architecture. One of the suppositions that Sam and I made going into this was that in a city like Los Angeles and a region like Southern California, you cannot pull apart the relationships between things like transit, infrastructure, city spaces, communities, economics, capital in particular, and architecture. And to think out a future for this region means possibly that we need to start to discuss these matters synthetically. For better or worse, transportation design and urban design have, for the better part of the last century, been dealt with by different professionals, sometimes in communication, quite often not. Our hope in staging this competition was to suggest that you cannot design one without the other today, because the implications for the growth or the intelligent growth of this region now require an understanding of the local implications of regional decisions and the regional implications of local decisions. So if I may actually start with that as a kind of place to begin this discussion. I don't know who would like to take that up, but that would be the first observation.
And just remind us before you speak who you are the first time around.
Well, I can take this up.
Roland Genik.
I'm Roland Genik. I'm an urban designer and architect, and working on transit lines here in the city. And What Peter says is interesting in a sense that those lines that we already have, and I'd like to remind everybody that we actually have a lot more public transportation than is commonly thought of. But those lines that we currently have, they were mostly picked via a selection that is heavily focused on available right-of-way, and then were designed being relatively locally focused on an individual station, and then within the station even on like local, sort of like just small pieces, like canopies, railings, furniture, public art. And I think what this competition wanted to do is open this up into a broader perspective and try to figure out how can some of the sort of organizing urban design aspects that transit has in other cities, how can that become more inherent to the design of the system and really let the infrastructure and the sort of aesthetics that the infrastructure overlays over the city become an organizing armature that frames the city, and we're not even sure whether the city is really still the right term for it, but where the infrastructure becomes an organizing visual element that goes beyond just individual localized station, where it becomes more than just a station design. And I think that was, for me, the surprising element in this competition, that those entries that were most successful in the jury's opinion were those where the transformation is not so much an intentional active design, where the transformation comes from a systematic approach and sort of can be let loose and take over by itself.
You know, I'm Neil Denari. The premise of the competition in 3 or 4 ways makes it a kind of almost an idea competition that on the one hand is fighting the pessimism of the future of operating on a city that wants to reject mass transportation because it's already been built as a city about private modalities. And, you know, in that sense, if one pessimistic view is it's like a dead horse that's been beaten one too many times, yet at the other level, of course, the city is going to grow, and we can't just let a fatal discourse play out that more and more people, more and more congestion, more and more pollution, and so forth. Maybe I'm not talking as particular as you were, Roland, but I don't have the same kind of day-to-day position, obviously, that you do about solving for some of the expansion of the lines. So, number one, we're also dealing with a competition that was an ideas competition for which, unlike, let's say, doing a fire station on the corner, we judge apples to apples, good fire station, bad fire station. It was a really provocative discussion that we had because nothing could be seen, really one project to the next. It was the gestalt, I think, of all 75 that made it into a pretty interesting project because everybody's playing more or less a different set of, with a different set of rules in many, many ways. And that's why I think the ones that we chose actually all have different rules. And if you don't abide by those rules, you don't understand, you know, a particular scheme, the extent to which design becomes an operative device, the extent to which time becomes an operative device, technology becomes an operative device, and you can see all the schemes have you know, kind of different agendas. I think in many ways the outcome of the jury was, are we closer to a set of rules to work on a set of agendas, whatever it might be. As I think Eric and I and Tom in particular were talking about the competition setting out to try to exactly find out what the problems are, even though we imagine them as it'll get more and more and more problematic, but in exactly that way. If we all had clean cars and there was no pollution, yet we were commuting 4 hours a day, I submit that the skies would be clean, but life would be terrible. So at one level, the idea of even cultural sustainability comes into play, as well as the idea of a kind of physical set of forms of sustainability. That was implicated, I believe, in all the projects.
I'm Aspet Davidian with Metro. I'm an architect and studied urbanism and done some urban projects as well. The beauty of this competition is this is the most opportune time that we are getting the major measure R, which is 0.5% plus the 1.5% public tax, is a great investment in our transit system. Obviously, majority of that goes before to highways, freeways, expansion and improvement. But this measure is changing that equation by about 35% of it is going to go to transit, and the rest will go different parts of the improvement and urban as well as the transit in general. I was really excited with all this entrance and the diverse thinking, but mostly they were converging into the use of the rail, obviously, versus the highways, because we are stuck in the highways, and we have to expand and widen, and we are doing it right now, and it will continue. Obviously, individual cars are going to be there, but the mass transit is what we are trying to start rethinking and dream about our urban planning and how the whole infrastructure has to change. Just compared with the East Coast or our North city, San Francisco, or European cities, I mean, any great city has a major rail system, and most of the participants in this competition, they have created the same concept of high speed or intermodal. Obviously, you have to create that from the start to the destination, how you connect seamlessly. Myself, I spend half of my transportation in public transit and half in my individual cars. That is life. Majority, they spend mostly 100% in their individual cars, and that's our system and our whole Los Angeles, widespread about more than 40 cities. Still, it will be the same, but the connectivity combining all the transportation infrastructure, and basically intermodal, we have to have this rapid rail, the subway, light rail, bus system, which fortunately Orange Line we have done and we are expanding. It's dedicated right that way. And the individual cars. Now the rolling stocks, the new cars are more sufficient, less gas consumption, and it's going to help us in our life quality, standard of life, and basically our efficiency in our life and quality of it. But I wish we had more time to review those participants. You know, 6 hours was not enough. And myself, I have missed a lot of good concepts, and they have gone very quick. I wish we had maybe 3 days to spend on all these, participants and read it carefully, because there are a lot of good information there. And we really appreciate. I'm very excited that our future city, our future in Los Angeles will change drastically. Transit is a huge, very slow progress. And one subway, 10 mile or 20 mile, takes almost 10 to 15 years to build. That's what it took us 17 miles for the Red Line to build in 15 years. From 1983 until 2000, we finished, even more than 15 years. So it's a very slow pace, but that's the future. We are going to rethink and reevaluate our living culture and our choices.
Aspet, thank you. Let me refine the point I made earlier. because I'm very interested in implementation of policy. You know, Gail noted today that roughly half the jury sits within public organizations, civic organizations. So yourself, Cecilia Estolano, the CRA, Gail, the director of LA City Planning. And the rest of the jury was made up of designers, Eric Owen Moss, who will join us shortly, director of the school, Tom Main, Neil Denari, Roland Genik, and Jeff Wardle, actually, who's not here, but who is the director of advanced mobility studies at Art Center. How do we move beyond a discussion of rights of way, for instance, as the path of least resistance, towards policies that would encourage more integrated solutions? Many of the entries that were premiated suggest a very radical rethinking of policy and process.
If I can make a comment on that one, and again, I'm David Bergman, and I'm a co-coordinator along with Peter Zellner in the SCI-Fi at SCI-Arc program. It's very interesting that we've talked about the pace at which these kinds of infrastructure investments proceed. In the early 1980s, when we passed the initial 2 1/2-cent sales tax assessments here in Los Angeles County, we produced, now it's been almost 30 years, a tremendous track record: Red Line, Blue Line first, Red Line, Metrolink, Gold Line, Orange Line. But all of them tend to be based in 19th century and 20th century technologies. We only began in recent years to begin thinking about integrating information technology into this transportation and transit system. In the 1980s, there was a lot of thinking that, well, the solution would be through intelligent vehicle highway systems. That has been an idea that has not necessarily been implemented through our infrastructure. We've taken some information technology controls through the rapid bus, but it's still the 19th century internal combustion engine that's running, the propulsion system. And what was so interesting about both the professional and the student entries was a desire to bring 21st century technology, particularly in the form of information technology, into suggestions about what the next 30 years might look like as we begin to implement transit solutions in the county.
I think that's an interesting aspect, because we found that a lot of the designs were, well, there was somewhat of a split between those designs that accepted the status quo and said, well, let's try to figure out how we're building better designed transit system. And then there were all the entries that were picking at really trying to solve individual movement through the city. And regardless of whether that was with a technology that was in existence already, or whether that was really just avoiding movement altogether, because the transit system will only accommodate those movements that people make that have decided that they need to go from A to B and find a way to be transported that way. But if we can, with the help of better transportation systems, can eliminate the necessity for movement, because we're combining trips together, and you do something else on your way back home from work and eliminating those trips, there's actually almost more potential there than through like carpooling and those elements. So I think you're hitting on a good point there to sort of track the movement at the core and see how you can change behavioral pattern in how people move around the city. There were a lot of interesting aspects. To just for a moment come back to the right-of-way issue, because when you look at the current system map that we have, you will find those are all almost all existing railroad right-of-ways, and luckily we have a lot of them. But when you think beyond that, the only other large amount of publicly owned right-of-way that we have in the city are the freeways. Caltrans is the largest property owner in the state. They own more property than anybody else. And I think a lot of entries recognize that, and I think there's a tremendous opportunity in either taking some of that right-of-way and reusing it for something else, or in some fashion organize it more efficiently so that right-of-way becomes available. Because I don't think you will be able to cost-effectively develop a transit system if you're relying on real estate purchase to accommodate it. So it's a real challenge there from a policy standpoint. It's like, where do you get the land? And I don't know what.
Well, it's true. MTA early 90s bought many hundreds of miles of Union Pacific, whatever other old railroad right-of-way, and we are fortunate that we bought it very on time, cheap, and we are expanding it. The highways are actually is one of the best right-of-way we can have, and there is that again the thought that we have to start taking a portion of the freeways and make it for rail, use it for rail. The access to the transit is very important. And obviously, in this time that we are thinking, in this time frame, and the way we are dreaming how our city is our city is what it is. And unfortunately, it is spread out, very low density. The transit justifies and is efficient when there is a high density. The land use should change. Now we have to rethink about our planning system, our political decision makers, where are we investing our public taxpayers' money, look at other parts of the world. And what they have done, they have created a very extensive rail system, subway at grade elevated, and with different speeds. And it is connected. Connectivity intermodal and getting at least our size of our neighborhood and communities, how those neighborhood plan and the density that they have access, let's say 10-15 minutes to a bus station, then from there they can get to the rail and get to the work or wherever their destination is. So it's a big challenge, but fortunately we are forced now with getting more expensive oil, we are starting to think about the mass transit. So we have been through this bad habit of spending our time, and because of the cheap oil, for decades we have created this huge infrastructure of freeways, expanded suburbs, and it's going to start to change. The future, the rail system will change, and we are going to have a better lifestyle, and still we will enjoy our cars, but we will be more connected to each other. We won't be individually driving. We get more social interaction, and that's the life in the cities. And now we are coming back infill development, and also transit creates a huge transit-oriented development, and it's a big improvement for the city. Look at the Hollywood corridor or wheelchair corridor. Recently, the last maybe a decade, we have almost over $2 billion of the joint development all around our stations. So this is going to help the individuals, the city, and everyone.
Let me just ask quickly, I just have a quick thing, and then we'll start to take some questions perhaps. But just specifically to the plans, because obviously there were some very new, or perhaps very innovative ideas. I think that there were some ideas that could possibly be implemented. A lot of them, you said, as you were saying, worked with building new infrastructure along or under or next to or something, the highway rights of way. Some of them talked about light rail, but doing it in the midst of more parks or more greener efforts. And some of them what are some of the other ones that I kind of mentioned here? Someone using stations, more mixed use, just kind of, if you have a station, you might as well put a whole development around it. That's beyond just transit-oriented development, but actually thinking about the stations and having cars, perhaps subway cars that could turn into buses. I don't know if that's something possible. But you know, just all sorts of new thinking. Is there anything that you saw that you thought, well, maybe this idea could work? And if it could work, how do you implement something like that?
I think all these ideas presented will work. We need the high-speed rail because the vast, physical dimensions of our megalopolis. We have to create that, and also connection, regional connections. The intermodal is very important. We have to be able to get easily access from, say, our individual car to bus to train and get back to the same. This should be seamless, and it is working. Fortunately, small parts of our country, for instance in Seattle, there's a 4-mile downtown tunnel. It is dual. It has bus, electric bus, and then it turns into light rail as well, and expanded to different parts of the airport and more. All these things have been done, and tons of these experiences have been successfully done in the world. So we have just to come to the decision and political power to change our present thinking, invest. The investment, the muscle is the funding. There are brilliant ideas, but who is the political power to make that decision? Enough spending on the freeways, let's build on the rails and other transit system which creates a much better life, more social, and a lot of quality in life improved.
I think the interesting aspect on what has changed and what is actually implementable is really happened initially when LA County, in an economic difficult time, decided for themselves that they want to actually tax themselves to raise money over 30 years, $40 billion. That's a lot of money to change how the city connects and change what the city is based on. And we had big discussions over the sort of possibility to have an overarching idea to organize this city, and in a comparison to like in a Haussmannian way, where you say, well, I know what the city needs to be like, and I'm going to cut all these axes through the city. And I think we all believe that in LA, from a political standpoint, that is very difficult. But what then all of a sudden happened is that the public said, well, let's raise $40 billion and build something over 30 years. So all of a sudden we have an organizing framework that will suck up a lot of money and will put that money into the ground, and it will become part of our built environment. So I think that's where the real chance is with that legislature that will keep pumping money into an organized overall framework. And that's where I think the sort of opportunity is, and not so much in, oh, we have this technology or that technology. It's really beyond that, I think.
Do you mean like frameworks within, like Measure R right now, the way it's worded, does not have, Measure R the way it's worded right now, specifically talks about transit schemes, but it doesn't, from my knowledge, go so much into an overall scheme of planning. And is that what you mean by a framework?
And to that point, and let me just introduce Eric Belmont's director of SCI-Arc, Principal Eric Belmont's Architects, who's on the jury. Thank you, Eric, for coming. But to that point, Roland, I wonder how much of what you describe as kind of public will, in a way, gets translated into protocols for translating the way we do things into the way we could do things. Because it seems to me that there are very many entrenched ways of making transit systems, but what many of the competitors proposed actually would require that those policies be fundamentally rewritten. In other words, how do you get all the pieces to talk to each other?
And if I can put an even finer point on it, this is our second tranche in 30 years. And maybe in that first 30 years, we were too timid. And maybe it was because it's such a large task. Now that we have the beginnings of mass transit infrastructure, fixed links, because we had buses before. Now that we have this in place, for the next 30 years, our challenge in this competition was to try and break through some of that timidity and to propose solutions that embrace new technologies, new institutions, new policy responses that would be truly transformative. And I think some of the tension between continuing the efforts of the first 2 half-cents in the first 30 years experience and looking at Measure R as an opportunity for disjunction was an interesting discourse that we had within the jury.
You know, the idea about what techniques are possible or what techniques did we see that were implementable, it really kind of dramatizes, again, the question about design versus, let's say, policy, or we talked a lot about lifestyle, being bigger drivers in the whole set of issues. First thing I asked Peter was how many flying car schemes are there? And there was only one. Between flying car schemes and adding a line here and adding a line there and making an extra lane, that's what paralyzes the discourse on the one hand, a kind of futurism. And I guess when the flying car culture unearths this tape, they'll laugh at me for doubting it all. But between that, there's a kind of paralysis of too strange and too futuristic or too minor. You know, when you think about LA and its footprint, you know, which is huge, it's pretty hard to think about reverse engineering, you know, a kind of mass transportation world for something, you know, so large. When they built the BART in San Francisco, of course, my brother, when he moved out there, he said, I'm going to go to the end of the BART line, the house will be the cheapest, but I'll be able to ride into the city. Theoretically, something like no more BART lines, everybody's got to move closer, but of course the idea is to service further and further out. So the idea of shrinking cities versus expanding cities, of course, has a big footprint, as well as it does with, you know, population. So the daunting task of literally reverse engineering that is really a challenge. When you think about something like, let's say, making a bike lane big enough where the fear of getting hit, as a cyclist, I feel this, could never happen in the city now because it would take away too much surface area for the cars. So the greater opportunity to change a paradigm is closed down by the overwhelming, if horrific, logic of the prevailing one. So my answer is, did we see any paradigm shifts that worked? We only saw one, the flying cars. It didn't win an award. So I think that's really a fantastic thing, though, about the project is we didn't see any, in my opinion. Therefore, the conundrum continues and the project continues.
Let me switch the discourse a little bit, because I think what was, for me, the most intriguing aspect of the discussion had to do with a whole series of extremely pragmatic proposals. 110 freeway runs south, intersects Orange County as it leaves Los Angeles, add a lane, those kinds of things. And it's certainly conceivable that we could run around this city for a long time and in a pragmatic way make a number of happenstance additions and subtractions. And in doing that, we could facilitate the movement systems and certainly make things easier than they are now. So there is some discourse on the efficacy of particular kinds of practical, narrowly defined solutions in specific areas. There's a larger discussion which has to do, I think, interestingly enough, with a city which at least has the reputation for having supported extremely an innovative discourse on architecture and design for the last 10, 15, 20 years, and finds itself in, as far as I can tell, in absolutely the reverse position with respect to making the city. And in the reverse position because particularly the neighborhood councils and the role of neighborhood councils, city council which divides the city into 15 fiefdoms, little bits of cities, Burbank and Culver City and Santa Monica and West Hollywood, a county structure which has 5 supervisorial districts. You try to make urban policy in a context with overlapping cities and overlapping jurisdictions, and the mayor, by the way, is not the mayor of Chicago and is not the mayor of New York. So just in terms of implementing a broader perspective, that is almost impossible, and it may be that what allowed architecture to flourish because of a lack of authority or central authority is precisely what makes it impossible to make big decisions in this kind of city. And I think in the end, there's something else. Either the context makes it impossible to do it, or the personality type that I walked in and I heard somebody talking about Haussmann, but whether it's Haussmann or Robert Moses, large-scale discourse with a capacity to implement a series of ideas ultimately is what's needed to remake the city, as far as I can tell. But it doesn't have to be across the city. It only need be, I think, experimentally. Give us a piece of the river. Give us a piece of the freeway. Those kinds of things. And if we had authority, the mayor, the head of the city planning department, or a different authority that would be inserted in this discourse, that would have the capacity to go in and to experiment. What can we do with the freeway in terms of all the kinds of things that are easy to talk about? So you deck it, and you green it, and you photovoltaic it, and you run your train down it, and you do all of those things. Very difficult to do without a venue to start. So I think in the end, authority needs to be there. Somebody needs to be willing to take the authority. I'm not sure that inclination is there because it's not egalitarian enough. Then we have to find a way to do that and to begin to implement the kinds of things that in an architectural way we were able to do and can't seem to do here. I just one small point. I gave a talk here the other night and showed a series of projects that we're doing in Los Angeles as opposed to other cities. And the mission from every client is essentially make the project go away. Make it go away. Because the apprehension about the neighborhood councils, and it used to be in 1947 I could drive down Sunset, and it used to be in 1959 I could see past my neighbor. And there's so much apprehension in general terms, and the politicians follow this, and they're elected short term. So I think there is not in place a mechanism, and I think there's not in place a will, if there would be a mechanism, to really do the kinds of things we're talking about.
Nobody wants to take that one on there.
Great.
Yeah, absolutely. And what we'd like to do, if I just may say, we'd like to start to have a kind of discussion with the audience, and particularly with the winners who are here today, in the remaining time that we have. Sam wants to say something.
To follow up what Eric was saying, obviously you have the balancing act between the big ideas and not disturbing neighborhoods, and you have the balancing act that politicians have to play between catering to their constituencies and trying to be visionary. But do you think that my hunch here is that there's one other problem besides the lack of a giant authority figure that can kind of take the lead. It's and the hunch that I have is part of why we're doing this competition, which is that you also need public will. Do you think that there's enough public will to really embark on a quote-unquote visionary scheme, or to quote-unquote embark on something that rethinks the way that we're, completely rethinks the way we're thinking about our city?
Well, but I think the public will is there. The public has said, yes, let's spend $40 billion over the next 30 years. The organizing authority sits right here, because they will, for the foreseeable future, unless we do some sort of mass transit revolt, they will be implementing, that's how the legislature is written, all the money will come through metros. So I think where the competition was so interesting is to see whether we have an overarching idea of what that will look like when it manifests itself from an urban design standpoint. And I think the answer was we didn't have a unified idea. If we had a unified idea and all the designs were coming in almost the same, then I don't think we would have a problem. I think the problem, after we had the political will and after we have an organizational structure to at least be legally charged with implementing the political will, I think where we're still struggling and where this competition is so important is what is it going to look like? And I don't know whether it has to look all the same. To just continue the Hausman discussion, it was mostly long axial tree-lined boulevards. There was one language that this sort of organizing scheme was implemented with. I'm not sure whether it needs one transit language.
You know, we are talking about $40 billion in territory. It's a minuscule money. Yeah, it is. Because look at the vast physical, dimensions of our city, Los Angeles. New York has 400 miles plus, maybe more than that, underground and rail system. And they have 7 million riders per day. We, with the bus, with everything, I think we have 1.4 million. Majority is bus, maybe 400 or so is the rail. Underground, obviously a little bit more, 250 or so, and the rest are the 4 lines, blue, green, gold, and whatever. But the understanding our life, way of life, our choices will change, because that's the necessity. Beverly Hills was against the subway, underground continuation to Wilshire, until 5 years ago, when they started to choke under the traffic jam. They started to change their mind, and now they are wholeheartedly supporting. So you have to see that the necessity, again, and efficiency in life will dictate us, not only individually, but also in public and our governmental thoughts. And obviously there are lots of interests, individual interests in every constituency and every city, from city council, neighborhood, everything. And it's difficult to change. They are archaic. They are just the same way in Glendale. I've been in planning commission for 6 years, but the majority, they want to keep Glendale the way it is. And it's unfortunately a lot of struggle. They said, no, you have to change the land use. You have to create more transit-oriented, bring the affordable and more dense housing on those corridors. So, we have so much difficulty. Every bit of transit system will help us a lot. In 1985, which we were almost through our red line design, we created a master plan close to 250 miles of heavy rail, light rail. And out of that, since 1985, we have only about 100 miles. So even then, with a smaller vision, which fortunately Bradley was very supporting, and hopefully this mayor and hopefully governor will help us, because it's really we need a lot of transit system to create. There is nothing new in it. They've been done many cities around the world, and they're living better.
You know, what's odd about what you said is not so much that the guys on Rodeo Drive changed their mind, is what's odd about it is that we care whether they change their mind. Because if you're going to make policy in a city where each one of these entities has the option to say today yes, tomorrow, yeah, maybe they change their mind tomorrow, I think the capacity to do something is completely emasculated by those kinds of authorities. The question Sam asked was, is there a will to do it? And part of, I mean, this is a culture that if you want to sell something, you stick it online and you stick it on a billboard and you stick it on a television screen. It's like you used to go through Beijing and at 5 o'clock in the morning you'd hear Chairman Mao's thoughts being played. And they shut it down about 4 in the morning. And pretty soon everybody knew that. Whether that kind of totalitarianism serves a purpose, we could argue. But for sure, if there is no public discourse or no sustained public discourse on this subject, you don't create a context in which this is topical. It's not topical, it's never discussed, it's never led, it's never advocated, it's never pushed over a period of time. And the only time it shows up is when it comes down your street, and then you're teed off because it's construction and dirt and noise and it's too high and you can't see and you used to go and now you can't, and see you later. And there's no or very little. I think somebody has to lead this discussion in the same way that people sell Reebok or Xenia or whatever the hell they're selling.
That's an interesting observation, but I think that leadership also falls to architects and designers who have not wanted to wade into the discussion of transit, urban planning for 15 to 20, maybe longer years. I mean, large-scale urban issues have been taboo and in some ways very dirty to talk about. And as architects, we've spent a lot of time talking about form for the last 10 or so years. No, I think so.
Athens Charter guys, Team 10 guys.
Fine, I'm talking about LA. 1980 to 2000. So I guess the question is, if we're talking about leadership, then it also falls to designers to start to take interest in this discourse.
But I mean, the reason for having the competition, and conceivably the reason that a lot of you are here, is to aid and abet a strong discussion, which is an enduring discussion, and gets these subjects to be topical, to be germane, to be relevant. The city and the organization of the city and the structure of the city, to me, you can work in the city as an architect and you can do plenty of mischief, project by project, and develop a career and a point of view and run around the world and do all kinds of things, and not sit in a city and make arguments for urban strategy and planning development in a context where there's not much reciprocity on the part of the city mothers and fathers. I mean, somebody has to, I mean, if there were a way to set up a different, like for example, what's his name? Dukakis is in charge of the high-speed rail discussion. Now, exactly what authority he has is probably a debate, but what he's trying to do is make whatever it is, San Francisco, Sacramento, LA, San Diego, and one of the projects that we acknowledged, I think, in part because it dealt with a very different scale of the urban problem, which is not so much what a mess all of the individual pieces or entities were, but what role a connector between those pieces would have in terms of both making connections and resolving issues internal to those cities. And it could be in the end that we don't have, I think we don't have the will, but we don't have the operational, institutionalized means to make the kinds of decisions here that we need to make. So I have two things. One, that has to be worked on. Maybe it comes through a new administration that talks a little about that, as opposed to the last. I mean, everybody hates Bush and everybody seems to prefer Clinton. And Clinton didn't do a hell of a lot either in terms of urban policy. Almost nothing, really. So this is endemic to a national structure and certainly to a local structure So I think what we can do, I'm not sure architects can operate the way Peter is saying. We can certainly engender a discourse, books, publications, media, all of that. But I think there have to be political figures who are willing to take this on as a subject. Iraq is a subject, for all the ridiculous reasons. The cities in America are substantial subjects. I mean, potholes blow up in the middle of Manhattan and they suck people away. And bridges fall down in the Mississippi River. So at some point, that might be as germane a subject as Baghdad is. And maybe that's what it'll take. But I think the will is missing in a national sense. I think the will is missing in a local sense. And I think at some point, we have to move that discussion, and we certainly have to try, and I think we are trying, but we need some help on the other end. This is not a discussion that can be handled as architects and engineers and consultants project by project. It's a different language, it's a different sociology, we're talking to different people, and we have to know, I think, how to talk to them. It's not like talking to a client. Like talking to the GA in a project you're trying to get. The constituency is different, and the language has to be different.
Well, I think that we can continue this discussion now with the audience, in particular with some of our winners here. So what I'd like to do, since we have about half an hour left before the opening of the exhibition, is hand the microphone to some of the competitors. Also note that we're going to continue this discussion on Friday, March 27th from 2 to 4 at Metro. Competition winners will be meeting with Metro Transit officials to see if some of these ideas are in fact able to be implemented, and that's at Metro Headquarters, Windsor Room, 15th floor, 1 Gateway Plaza, Los Angeles. That will be on our website. So let me see, are any competitors up for posing questions to the jury and or wanting to sort of enter this discussion? I see one hand here. Please introduce yourselves.
Hi, my name is Harry Silver, as one of the competitors. I just have a question to the jury as well as to the audience. I want to get a little reality check. Who here took mass transit to come to this event? Okay, so we have about 6 people. I think that... Bicycles? Okay, bicycles too. Okay, thanks. And
bicycles and mass transit.
Right, and with the...
Anyone you can walk here from, we have walkable urbanism close to SCI-Arc as well.
And for the, not to embarrass anyone on the jury, but for the jury, did anyone here take mass transit to get to this event?
Actually, I use every day.
Wait.
I use every day.
But
however, today, it doesn't count.
Okay, and your point is?
Well, my point is that it seems that the jury is talking about how they want to sort of build all of these light rail systems, and the reality is that that's not how people are moving around. We did some basic research, and one of the things that was really interesting was that a lot of people who lived in LA, they never even once rode the bus. And so the question is, moving towards this bigger system, saying, well, we want you to do this versus the reality seems to be like a really big disconnect.
If I can react to that, I mean, my experience with transit in LA, working as a planning practitioner, is that everybody loves transit for somebody else, so that the other guy takes it and your life gets more convenient. And this, I think, goes to my earlier point about the timidity of the systems that we've put in place. And what we wanted to engender in this competition, and I think what we acknowledged, what the jury acknowledged, was a rethinking beyond the marginal improvement of extending a line to the sea or making a prettier or more accessible station stop. So in a sense, it reflects your question. I mean, who are you to say that people should be using transit? And the answer is, the customer is right. The fact that we don't have that level of utilization means we need to be rethinking it. And that was the challenge we wanted to put out to you all.
Because we don't have the access, we don't have choice. Where is the red line or the light rail continuing in this whole huge city? You don't have. I wish I could take transit after I walk 10 minutes and then get to the train, but I have to drive 10 minutes to get to the train. So our neighborhood planning, our low density, that is what we are doing, our inefficient way of life. But you know, the necessity is mother of invention, and we are going to pay and come to that point. As long as we are paying cheap money for the gas, we will drive. By the time it got to $4, we had almost 30–40% jump in our ridership, transit system, the whole bus and the train. So it is nothing new. I mean, it is proven fact. We will change our choices once we get to that necessity.
No, I think it's a good point about issue of access, and your comments are at one level kind of lay out the fact that sensibility or consciousness at the moment would be partly guiding anybody who's got the means to be able to otherwise take public transportation. In other words, not being forced to. And David referred to that. You know, in the NBA, they have this thing called the luxury tax. You know about that? And Jerry Buss pays a lot of money to the players because he wants to win championships. And they have the luxury tax so that a team like Oklahoma City or something can compete, lower level of salaries in a way. And so the Yankees and the Lakers are hated because they just pay a lot. And if you think about taxing, you know, one level our luxury to be able to not do something, it might force issues into, well, I don't want to do that anymore. Now, we could be taxed, but we'd also need the access to be able to, you know, relieve that if we didn't want to. Because I think your point is, the consciousness is there for millions of people. It's sort of saying something like, wow, it's really tough for me to put in an extra hour in the day right now to be able to take 3 buses and so forth. That's either an excuse or it's a reality. And all of these conditions are operating in a way in terms of being able to offer access or more coercively forcing lifestyle changes as opposed to what are your politics and what are your feelings and are you an environmentalist and so forth. Isn't that really, in the end, I think, what your question or what your statement surrounds a little bit?
Well, I guess it's a little more nuanced. I mean, one of the things that our research brought out was that, you know, people don't travel A to B during, we asked people to keep logs of their travel. We realized that people don't travel to work and then come home. They're just moving all around. And so it's not really a choice. But I guess the other, so it was just a little more nuanced than that. And the other thing is that there's just this incredible system that's not really being utilized, which is the system that's everyone's using. And maybe it's just so big that people can't see it. But how do you add intelligence onto the current roadway system versus just trying to blow it up? And it seems like, you know, if everyone's moving around, most people are just in their cars alone, that's an opportunity.
Yeah, but what you'd have to do, I mean, it's interesting, if people compare, as often happens, LA versus Paris and New York or London, and very peculiar kinds of comparisons. If you say there are X amount of million riders a day in Manhattan, I mean, you can go from Yankee Stadium to Wall Street in 15 minutes. You try going from Santa Monica to downtown in how many hours? I mean, you're comparing systems that are operationally intelligible with systems, if they're even systems, which are almost entirely piecemeal. What in order to test the efficacy of transit in this city, you have to have an intelligent system with some capacity. If you're going to get out of your car, it takes you an hour in the car, so give me a chance, give me an hour and a half or something. But don't give me six changes in mode and means and waiting and raining and whatever it is. Nobody is going to make that choice. So you have to make the choice a plausible choice. And that requires, in this city, a much more comprehensive, much less piecemeal happenstance. I mean, the mayor came out and he said, we'll get to the sea on Wilshire Boulevard in 2032. It sounds like something that nobody cares about. 2032? I mean, they just went from Beijing to Shanghai to Shenzhen to Guangzhou and other differences in 2 years.
Well, but I think
2 years.
I think your question is also, and you're right, that people move around in the city that is easier, make movements that are easier to make in individualized cars, but let's not forget the fact that it is that way is because since the 50s, we've made every effort to make that convenient. And that's why over half a century, people in their behavior have adapted to that. We haven't made that same effort for infrastructure in a public transit type of way. So I think the comparison and the sort of measuring the reality right now, wherever you go, there's either free or very cheap parking. There's gas stations everywhere. There's, you know, all the support that allows that individualized travel has been put in place. There's a multitude of money that has been spent on that over half a century. That's why it's easy, and you know that's why people follow it. And let's not kid ourselves. We're not going to get all rid of our cars, but right now we have a public transit trips maybe like 6-7%. If we get that to 30%, then we've achieved a lot. And
Hi, Anthony Monza from NBBJ. We've talked about the public will, and we've talked about policymakers, but haven't really discussed the main drivers for urban development, which is private market, the real estate industry, and making these plans, incentivizing the plans, maybe through public policy, but also arguing the investment gains that can be made through smart development like this. And I think the demographics are in our favor, meaning the people who want to make better cities. And the market is changing too. But we've got to get those people on board in order to get these policies to really push forward, don't we?
Do you mean get them on board by subsidizing, or get them on board by asking them to take less profit?
Well, I think the profit issue is, what I'm saying is changing gradually. And that these sort of transit-oriented developments are actually proving to be much more marketable, especially with the demographic change in urban dwellers, and also through public policy. Obviously, there needs to be a partnership, but it's got to be with the public and the private together in order to implement all of this.
Can I tell you a couple of stories from my practice as a land use economist and planner that are so peculiar to Los Angeles that have served to undercut the logic of return on investment for transit-oriented development. And the first one comes actually from the MTA's joint development efforts and the attitudes towards which they take towards potential private partners. And the fact that they will not do an economic development write-down of land, and the fact that they really are not able to enter into creative financial relationships with private partners means that you have these beautiful, very expensive station stops that deliver you to these beautiful plazas and El Gran Burrito next to LA City College. The agency's track record is not very good and has not been able to creatively put together deals except for in the most overheated real estate market. Now there's a public policy piece to it that is also a problem. And this gets to Eric's point about not about my neighborhood. Working on the station area neighborhood plans, where we began a process of trying to bring up zoning to allow transit-oriented development in and around those station sites along the red line. The very same communities that back in the 1980s were saying, we need transit, we need rail transit for green reasons, for sustainability reasons, for social equity reasons, turned around and said, if you want to increase the value of land through an upzoning near our station sites, that's environmental racism. Because you wouldn't put that density in Pacific Palisades. So we have this institutional paralysis that other cities where you have very successful track records of transit-oriented development building real public-private partnerships that attract innovative development. We can't do it because of our politics, our neighborhood structure, and because of our institution that's on the public side. It's at a stasis.
We are experimenting the TOD projects, and I think the first
you
one...
might want to get a little closer to the mic.
Yeah, the transit-oriented development TODs. The first one I did was the Trizac at the Hollywood Highland. That was a good project. Unfortunately, it didn't have the residential unit there. It is mostly entertainment shops. But presently, we are...
Good project for who? I mean, it led to the largest write-down in real estate value in Los Angeles County's history up until the present, as far as I know. I mean, if you looked at it from a financial perspective, it's an advertisement to private industry not to do business with the MTA.
Why?
Because it's tremendous failure.
No, hold on a second. Trizac when it built, and yes, it was over $400 million, and that was the worst real estate time. It went down. Don't blame MTA or the guy, the private developer. You blame it to the cycle of the economy. Then the smart guy, Singh Group, came and bought that property with half price.
That's right.
And then
Owner always makes money.
Yeah, obviously. But don't blame the TOD or the development in the community. The red line, we spent about $4.5 billion of the public money the last, starting from 1985 until 2015 years, we spent almost $4.5 to $5 billion. We built that 17-mile red line. We created 17 stations, and each station is a gold mine for that community, for that city, neighborhood, and it is thriving now. We have built the Wilshire Western, a great successful project right now. It is finished at the Koreatown, and it will be a great success. We are building Hollywood Wine with $600 million, private, W Hotel and the rest, residential, commercial, luxury, and so on. We have created the Wilshire Hollywood Western, affordable 60 unit, and they was very successful. We have done that very successful projects, but always in the success in the real estate, it goes with the market value and the demand. But let's come back to the reality of our life. The access and choice comes from the expanded network. Once we have to build the rail, we have to build anyway rapid the high speed, maglev, the rapid underground, elevated, and all these things. Those are the network we have to expand rather than all our freeways. And we will convert some of the freeways. The transition is going to be lengthy, but we are on that road, and I believe LA will change drastically and much better way, a great city.
Why does everybody say that public-private, what is a public-private partnership? Why should we do that?
We lease the land, we don't sell it, we have 60 years of rental.
But I mean the mechanism for doing it. I mean, why is there so much advocacy of putting together public and private? That's supposed to be an idea for getting things done.
All right.
Why is it an idea for getting things done?
So what is your suggestion?
I'm asking you. I'll
It is all the money issue. The public comes with a mind of...
When we walked into Baghdad, we didn't say, let's make it a public-private enterprise.
They're risking their money, and they are...
You want a suggestion?
Speaking of the public, we have a member of the public here who would like to actually say something, so.
Wait a minute.
What makes this so imperative is one thing we're not discussing yet, and that's the public tragedy that happens every day because of our transportation system. We must be, you can see it all on the 11 o'clock news, that it's just in terrible shape, and that each one of us is in danger every day of our life, and we can be snuffed out, as you see. And that, I think that we had just better get to work and get some
We
action.
are discussing that. And the question is how to rectify it. That's the question. I mean, I think they no doubt that that's a dilemma. I think my point is, to somebody over here who said, let's make some, I mean, you want public-private projects, Times Square, times 500. I mean, every one of these things is the train stops, people get off the train, and you got some Arby's and some Zania and whatever it is. You got some housing, some office. It's not a conceptual policy idea. It's that the train stop is, guess what? A lot of people in and out, a lot of dinero, buy, sell, do all of that. Business is business. That's the idea. Well, what kind of idea is that? I mean, it's a very conventional way of bringing money into a context because the assumption is that's the way you'll get somebody to touch an area that otherwise wouldn't be touched. How the hell did they do the monument for the Jews in Berlin? Was that a public-private project? It's one of the most wonderful, it's a fascinating piece of urbanism. You know, not one Nike store and zero yogurt stands. And it's one of the dances. It's fascinating. You got that. I saw a film. I don't know, it must be a year ago. He's sitting in a hotel somewhere, Vienna or something, and he's trying to turn on the TV. Couldn't understand anything, and all of a sudden here comes a program, of course in German, and somebody set up a camera in that project and shot down the slots between the blocks for an hour and had various discussions. And there are kids running back and forth, there are guys skateboarding over the top, there's a boyfriend and girlfriend, a couple elderly people arguing like hell that this is all sacrilege and the purpose was missed. But it's a wonderful urban event. And it's an urban event without a scintilla of commercial activity. And the issue now, there's a substantive social and historical issue in all of that. But it seems to me that kind of lesson, to do that kind of project and add to it, is really what we're looking for rather than just finding a way so whoever it is, whether it's Forest City or Urban Partners, and some of the more enlightened developers can come in and do these things. Where's the other voice? Where's the public voice? Where's the voice of a public perspective with some authority to develop public policy into which these guys can come? Otherwise, we're just asking for yogurt stands. And that's public-private. It's not anything. Terrible.
I have to say that. Go ahead.
Ryan,
I'll do it later.
Student. I was wondering if there's a way in which we could approach the existing political boundaries or these individual cities that we sort of want to say, okay, there's one Los Angeles, but in reality, I mean, Los Angeles didn't really develop that way. There was Santa Monica originally and downtown originally, and then essentially all the development along these transit corridors connected those two cities, or connected those different areas. Is there a way in which we could say, okay, what if each one of these cities was self-sufficient in a way, and then the transit, I mean, that you wouldn't necessarily need to be moving around, like the separation between where you work, where you live, where you entertain, or that, you know, that path doesn't necessarily need to be across the city. So I guess what I'm getting at is there a strategy that doesn't necessarily deal with, well, we need to redraw the boundaries of political whatever, it would be more of an architectural solution. How do you say, what, you know, how do you really get like a work-live situation that would be more appealing to people? Like people who live in Palisades wouldn't mind having a retail center there that was not just a lifestyle center or something. It would be beyond that. So I mean, it would be in our realm as opposed to policymakers' realm.
Yeah, I think that is a big part. It's still in the realm of policy, and it's something that when I've talked to urban planners about the subject of infrastructure and the subject of the problems we have, they talk about it a lot, that trying to zone areas so that you work near where you live so you don't have to worry about commuting is a big part of it. But it is, and I think it would make a huge difference because we wouldn't have these huge commutes. But there are times when you have no choice and you have to go across town, and that's when I think effective transit is preferable to taking your car. I drive here, it takes me 10 minutes, and if I take the bus, it takes me about half an hour. But if I'm going to go across to Santa Monica on a normal day, that could take me an hour and a half, whereas if they were effective transit back and forth, mass transit, it could take half that, or even if you have high speed, you could do that in 15 minutes. So that, in that case, that's where you still need to do it and where transit can be more effective. But I don't think mass transit is the solution for everything. I think on a local scale, in a lot of ways, the car can work, and if you're only going 2 minutes, 3 minutes, maybe it's not as damaging. I guess that may be sacrilegious to say, but or you take your bike is another thing. But if it's just out of that, there's that fuzzy line. But anyway, there's a time when either one can do it. But I think that the realm of policy, as far as focusing on the local, which is something that we really need to do here, is something that, from what I've understood, planners are talking a lot about trying to zone things so that you work near where you live, so everything you do is near where you live, and I think that's the way LA in a lot of ways has worked out anyway, just by default. I don't know many people in my neighborhood that really go very far beyond there, unless they really have to.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting aspect, and of course, every trip that doesn't have to be taken reduces overall congestion. But to some degree, I think this romantic notion of having everything close together and living in a local environment and in a local economy, that's all great. But I think when you're really looking at it, there aren't very many people who really truly want that. Otherwise, all the small towns in Kentucky that have a main street with a grocery store and one restaurant, they would all be booming and they would be full with happy people. In reality, that's not really true. For a myriad of reasons, people are drawn to those mega centers, and so I think it has to be dealt with in a conjunction. Doing one or the other won't do the trick.
Roland, I mean, there's the consensual kind of hallucination that we all participate in this city, which is I live in Silver Lake and I don't go to downtown, or I don't go to Santa Monica, or I live in Burbank and I don't need to go to Inglewood. But the reality is that hallucination perpetuates a notion that somehow from Ventura to the border is one very interconnected urban problem. And so, you could look also at Orange County where, the 405 hits and they say no more trains, we want more lanes. Until we start to look at these problems as a matter of public policy, and I think to Eric's point of governance, and we see this sort of interrelationship between local and regional problems, regional dilemmas, and local expressions, if we are continuing to say, well, Culver City is a great model, and we can apply it somewhere else, and we can apply it somewhere else again, I think that you only end up with kind of incremental change. And then we're not at 2032, we're at 2056. So, the winners who I think are here and wanted to say something really did look at figuring out how something like the Yamanote line in Tokyo or the Loop in Chicago deal with a much bigger realm.
Yeah, I think for us, maybe one of the interesting things about the competition and something we struggled with a lot at the beginning was the necessity for the two boards. And it was a huge frustration, I think, on our part. Like, they seem like such different issues. How do you deal with the neighborhood, and how do you actually implement decisions that have already been made by Metro? And then how do you basically question everything Metro has done at the scale of the region? And I think our concept actually developed out of that frustration, that it could be possible to do both, and it could be possible that solutions at those different scales need to be very different. How at the scale of the region could we act in a very bold way and have something that could be figural and that could really bind the region together? And then how we could still have something at the scale of the neighborhood that could be more, that could integrate more into what's there. And I think that in Los Angeles we want it all. I don't see any reason why we should feel ashamed for saying that. I think that we do want to be able to have real neighborhoods. And we still want to have the possibility of kind of waking up and going to the mountains and then having lunch in the desert and then having dinner at the ocean. I think that that's still very much a part of the Angelino lifestyle. So I'm always a little bit sad when discussions in Los Angeles about public transportation tend to flatten the city back more into the way other cities operate, where it's about just neighborhood lifestyle. And I think that's not really what this city is about at its heart. I think we should feel liberated a little bit to want to move across the landscape in a larger way. But to allow that to happen, we actually need some big, bold moves at the scale of the region. And that's obviously something that's been out of the reach of Metro up until now. It's just not something that Metro's been charged with to actually deal with Los Angeles as a region.
Thanks. I know I keep waving my hand around because there's so many issues. But I'd just like to reinforce Eric's point about the fact that we are kind of a city of enclaves already. It's just a done deal. And your discussion about, elective transportation, elective trips, I think is very much part of the Los Angeles lifestyle. But I think the critical thing to solve has more to do with those, those sort of imperatives of getting to work every morning, getting home every evening, getting to work the next morning, getting home the next evening. And those things should not be encouraged, I don't believe, to be 10, 20, 30-mile trips. I think we have to wean the city of its addiction to that kind of commuting. We have to kind of slowly choke it off over 15 years. And we're a very volatile society. And if you look at the number of times people change their place of residence through the lifetime of a family, you'll see that very often within 15 years they've moved 3 or 4 times already. And they've changed jobs 3 or 4 times. And so I truly think that there's an incremental approach to this, which could begin to focus more energy on neighborhoods and wean people away from long-distance commuting.
I wanted to mention that under the umbrella of APTA, American Public Transit Administration, the transit agencies from East Coast, West, South, about at least 8, New York, Miami, Chicago, and San Francisco, Vancouver, and others. We are working together the last 1 year on a series of urban design. We are creating urban design standards, transit, starting from the neighborhood units, from walkability, bikeways, every mode of transit. And it is going to be published hopefully toward August this year, and it would be public documents. And APTA is really spending good funds to create that understanding between the agencies to standardize, because we are doing the same thing over and over. Hearing, sharing is a great thing. We are learning and working much better successfully. But it is coming. The more public is aware and the more they are appreciating this transit system, but first they have to have it, to have that choice, have the access, and it will be appreciated.
Well, Craig raised an interesting point. I think part of the difficulty with this discussion is, what are we doing? What problem are we solving? I mean, if we're looking at the city and we're trying to say, okay, everybody still wants to keep doing exactly what they're doing now, make it easier. That's one way to look at it. Craig said something a little bit different. Change the pro forma. Don't let them do certain things. Instead of going long distances, you have to make the city operationally intelligible over short distances. You have to do that. The promise of the city, to me, is less the neighborhood stuff. I mean, the difficulty is all you guys like the neighborhood stuff, and a little neighborhood. You try to do something in Venice, and they kill you. So if what's fascinating about LA is how many times you live on the west side of LA, you go out to dinner in Boyle Heights. Probably not too often, but it's there. What you want to be able to do is use the city as a city meaning you may, I mean, this is an argument. I mean, this would be a policy. If you wanted to use the city as a city, meaning to make the reaches of the city. I mean, when's the last time anybody went down to the harbor? You know, to say it's a fascinating place. You see driving cranes, the biggest port in the world, or when you add it to Long Beach. You don't go unless you live there. And it seems to me that what is remarkable about the city would be to put into effect a policy which allows, which puts within your reach, in a reasonable way, all of those pieces, many of which are completely out of bounds. If you can get to where you work and get back and you stay alive, that would be, I think, in the current discussion, an achievement. And that actually is not much of an aspiration for a city in a cultural sense or in a civility sense. Not very good. It gets you to work faster. There are a lot of other things in the city. One day you go to the port, the next day you go to the mountains, you go to the sea, you go to downtown, and you use the city line. It's the way you use New York.
Okay, Eric, well, we should all move to New York then, but much smaller. It's 4, and what I thought we might do now is wrap, and we can continue this discussion. We have the exhibition opening now, but again, I wanted to thank our competitors and our jury members for their effort, and the intensity of this discussion will continue. Again, we're going to have an event. This will be all posted on our website and also the Architects newspaper. We're going to continue at Metro on Friday, March 27th from 2 to 4. We will then move to the Mack Center at the Schindler House Thursday, April 2nd from 7 to 9. We will have another discussion Tuesday, April 14th on transit and community at the Good Space. And we'll explain these in a second. Melrose Avenue. And finally, we'll have another discussion on the 26th with the AIA. They're structured as initially at Metro, a discussion between the winners and Metro Transit officials. When we move to the Mack Center, we're going to have a discussion around transit in the city. It's an urban scale discussion. At Good Space, we're going to talk about transit and community. And finally, we're going to wrap up with architects in transit at the AIA Mobius Dwell Conference, which is in June. So there's ample opportunity for us to continue this discussion. It seems that we've heard that it's vital and necessary for us as designers, as public officials, to continue to communicate around these issues. It doesn't seem that the discussion will move further if what we end up with was, an interesting afternoon on, in March at SCI-Arc. So the hope is, and the ambition for this competition was to begin a public discourse. Let me hand it off to Sam. He has a few comments to make, and then we're going to move over to...
Can I just have one quick also SCI-Arc comment on the ambitions, which is if you've enjoyed this competition and enjoyed this discussion, this is what we do in the SCIFI at SCI-Arc program. And I strongly encourage those of you that are students to seriously consider application, and those of you that are professionals that are looking to extend your education to seriously consider our one-year program here at SCI-Arc. There's obviously more information on the web. You can talk with Peter or I. The deadline for this year has passed, although we accept late admissions on a rolling basis as long as we have seats. And certainly we'd encourage you to think for the year beyond. Thank you.
And also, if you have a checkbook, you're welcome to open it so you can see more of these programs continue and stuff like this expand. So please donate to SCI-Arc.
And speaking of checkbooks, also want to thank again our sponsors. Without any of these sponsors, this would have not have happened. So I want to do that. Just some closing words on this. Make sure that the goal of this is not to have this end right here. So these conversations that we're having, if you can show up, it's great. If you can tell a friend, it'd be great. Some of them we're going to have urban planners and architects. Some of them we're going to have some of the public officials that actually make the decisions on this, including some of the people that legislated for Measure R. That's going to be at the Good Space. Just make sure that you keep in touch. So I have 3 requests that I just wrote down for you. 1, tell a friend about this and have a conversation about transit, just see what happens. Number 2 is go take another look at these boards here And definitely look at the pictures because they're beautiful, but read what the people actually wrote, because that's, to me, some of the most important thinking is actually some of the stuff that they wrote about thinking about transit. And the last thing, we're talking about Metro, and if you have an iPhone, there's an application you can get to check out Metro's schedules, so you can actually figure out how to take a bus or a subway here. So I recommend that. Yeah, because for me too, and this competition has interested me a lot more in taking public transit. And I think one of the biggest problems is that none of us really know what's really available. So, and there actually is quite a bit. But the more we take it to, the more we can understand how we can change it.
Metronet.
What is it? Yeah, you know better than I do. What is it?
Metro.net
Yeah.
is the center, and if you get through the webmail, you have tons of information on the transit system, everything.
I think you need an iPhone app. Yeah, an app for the iPhone. There's a problem for somebody to come up with to make it accessible. I know, I've tried it, and it's a web interface. But if you could figure out a way to do it as an iPhone app, you might get more usage.
I think we have it.
It's a web-based app.
It's a web-based app.
Yeah.
Downloads are slow. But all right, well, look, thank you very much again, and join us for lunch.